Great to be back. Hi, everybody. We got a great panel coming up. So media, which long held a monopoly information delivery, has always been prone to misuse, to manipulation, spreading falsehoods. But with the advent of the digital and unprecedented flow of information, the problem of figuring out where the truth is has become very acute. Fake information is reaching more and more people and starting to actually have a considerable impact on our lives. Today we'll try to find out how serious problem of misinformation is in today's world and how are the lines between fact and fiction blurred, and why the internet is making fake news so potent and perhaps dangerous. So let me introduce you our speakers. Arlem Desir, representative from OSCE on the freedom of the media. Please. Roger Fisk, American political strategist who worked on President Obama's campaign, head of the New Day strategy. Robert. And why Robert is getting mic'd up, our next speaker is Andriy Buzarov, journalist, political commentator, human rights activist from Ukraine. Andriy. Katerina Sirgatskova. Did I pronounce your name correctly? Yes. Ukrainian journalist, TV host, editor of Zabarona.com. Yusuf Omar, star of the conference, from the #OurStories project, United Kingdom. Welcome. Orhan Jamal, Russian journalist. Maybe not, next time. Okay, and Adil Jalilov, factcheckers. It is the first fact-checking platform in Kazakhstan and Southeast Asia. Welcome. Great to have all of you with us. Lots to discuss. So I'm going to try to have a 10-minute Q&A with each one of you, if you don't mind. That's about 2 to 3 questions, and if you could stick to 2-minute answers, that would be lovely. Then we would proceed to our expert in the audience. It's Aysel Janabayeva, an independent journalist, and as she likes to put it, very active fact-checker. She'll have a Q&A with all of you, and then we will have questions from the audience. I would like to go ahead and start with Roger, if you don't mind. So the very phrase fake news, it's been made famous by Donald Trump and his campaign for the president. His strategy, however, is marked by bypassing the traditional media altogether. He uses new technologies and tools to spread the message to his voters directly, and they don't need news channels. They read their man's thoughts on Twitter. What do you think? Do you feel that his victory is making traditional media redundant, leaving them kind of behind?
First off, thank you, and thank you to the organizers. This is my second time in Kazakhstan, and as I travel around the world, I tell everyone that they have to put Kazakhstan on their list to visit. That said, I don't think there's been a politician in history that's always been happy with everything that's been written about them, right? So a lot of this is somewhat timeless. I think the difference is there's strengths and weaknesses to it. We've come to a point where politicians can essentially sidestep a lot of traditional media and communicate directly to people, but any politician that's successful in doing that, and President Trump is successful in doing it, always still has one eye very closely tuned to the traditional coverage that they get. Very concerned about what's written in print, very concerned about what's on television. So the social media component of it is really just a new layer on a dynamic that's been there all along. That's my short answer.
Well, many would have argued that traditional mainstream media in general, they have always been this sort of a filter, an arbiter of what can be relayed to the audiences or not. And then with the Twitter and with the social media, you don't need that filter anymore. You can talk to your people directly. And that makes traditional media kind of outdated. It's almost as if social media is pushing the traditional media out, unless we start playing by their rules, and that's a war that we've lost already.
Well, it's very interesting because prior to the Trump candidacy and the Trump presidency, it was kind of an accepted part of conventional wisdom that journalism was dead in the United States. And so ironically, and everything you just said is accurate, but ironically, that ability for the candidate and now President Trump to communicate directly to his audience has, ironically, resulted in somewhat of a renaissance in journalism. So at the same time, it's if you look at readership, a lot of the newspapers and things like that people were essentially digging a grave for are actually flourishing now. So it has a very interesting proportional impact on traditional journalism, which is still going to have a role no matter what. We are in an age, I think, where personality is driving things much more than kind of information in a lot of ways. And if I were pressed, and I don't want to take your next question off your sheet, but if there is one similarity at all between the Obama campaigns and the Trump campaign, it's that they were first and foremost personality-driven campaigns. Barack Obama basically won despite the traditional machinery of the Democratic Party, and Donald Trump won despite the traditional machinery of the Republican Party, in large measure because of what you just said, that ability to sidestep and communicate directly to people. That said, both of our campaigns and so far his one campaign still looked at that ability to directly connect with news consumers through the lens of how that impacts traditional journalism. So it wasn't just jettisoned aside, it was more of a new way of approaching how you try to focus on that coverage and leverage that coverage to advance the goals of your campaign.
So since you brought up Obama campaign, you were in it, you're still very much in the heart of the PR. Obama campaign, yeah, it was also very innovative in terms of using new technologies, but still different from Trump's. And what I wonder is, when you compare, what are the differences? What are the contrasts? How do the fake news now affect the democratic processes in your country?
Well, let me answer the first part of your question, which how are they different? The organizing principle of the Obama campaigns was the individual. Everything we did was, how can we give tools to an individual to organize people already in their own lives? So if, say, for example, you wanted to support the campaign and become involved, and you were a nurse or a teacher or a small businessman or a woman or a lawyer, our tools were designed to give you the capacity to organize the people in your own life, the people in your neighborhood, the people you work with, the people you go to church with, etc., the people you grew up with. So that's a different exercise than the Trump campaign, which was very largely driven by, a celebrity profile, whereas we were looking at as building it from the individual up, and it was based on each individual that we hope to engage, which, say, for the sake of rough math, is 65 million people in the United States, and basing our tools around those individuals, as opposed to the Trump exercise, which was more driven by just this, kind of very, very high-profile, high-energy celebrity individual. So it was a much different way of engaging people, motivating them, and also the campaigns themselves provided much different tools and ways for people to become involved.
So do you think after Trump's victory, Twitter or like the social media is the new kingmaker, and anyone who's going to actually run for president after Trump is going to use the same techniques, and also maybe the rhetoric, which is more combative, very simplified?
Well, no is the short answer. And I hope I'm doing well keeping my answers to 2 minutes here. And I can say that because virtually everyone else is on Twitter, right? There's just some people that kind of crack that code, that find that special sauce, right? That resonates with people and gets through and attracts more followers and things like that. Every candidate that's run for president, or probably any office in the United States, in the last 15 years has been on social media. So it's not a question of that these tools weren't, hiding in plain sight. But he just came along, coming off a 10-year television career, having a 25, 30-year celebrity status already, and then, just kind of arrived at a moment in time where some of those tools were really becoming principal parts of the American conversation, and it meshed with his personality in a way, just as our tools meshed with Barack Obama's personality, in a way that captured where the country was at that moment in time, but I don't think necessarily any one of the personalities or the tools of the last 3 presidential campaigns could necessarily just easily be replicated by anyone, because if they could, they would have already done it.
All right, Robert, thank you very much. I would like to move on to our next speaker, Arlem Desir. Now, I know you answer for a very large territory, but if you don't mind, I know that you are also responsible for freedom of press in Europe. So do you mind if I ask you a question about Europe? Because in Europe, and I grew up there, if there's freedom of speech and journalism, that's definitely in Europe, because it's all based on diversity of opinions, it's Voltairean principles. There is so much of good reporting, neutral reporting, factual reporting, and yet people, for some reason, are really easy to dismiss the mainstream media in Europe and still believe the wacky stuff they see on Facebook or on Twitter or on internet. Why is that?
Well, in Europe, like elsewhere, of course, fake news has a very strong impact, and I'm now in charge of the OSCE, where there is Europe, but also the US, Russia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, very different countries, but we see that the impact of false information or just silly news are very strong everywhere. The terms fake news in itself doesn't define very clearly what we are speaking about, because there are very different kinds.
Can I define fake news? Fake news is a fabricated news, something that never happened, and a person made it up, whether filmed it or wrote it, and gives it out as a real news, and there's no way to verify it. That's fake news.
Yes, and that can be just invented by one person, and it is disseminated by others for many reasons, but perhaps they find it is just funny, or perhaps for ideological reason. But it could also be a kind of strategy by some political groups or even by state to try to meddle in the situation of another state, like, for example, in an electoral campaign, and we've seen this. So, in fact, it is of different nature, and there is many question about why those people, in a way, like fake news, because a lot of studies have shown in Europe, like everywhere else, that fake news are very much faster disseminate and reproduce and become viral much faster than real news. Perhaps that humanity prefers fake news since the beginning of the history. But there is a strong impact on democracy when there is a confusion, in a way, between fake news or fiction and information which are based on fact, on journalism, on professional standard of journalism. And the quality of information has to do with the quality of democracy. And there is something behind the Enlightenment conception of democracy since many centuries, which is that the democratic discussion is not based on an official truth, but on a discussion on the facts with different opinions, different views and analyses, but there is an attempt to make a distinction between the fact and the fake news. And the press has a very important role in this in the past, and when we read information in classical press in the past, was it in a printed press or listening to it on a TV, we knew from where comes the information, from which newsroom, with which ideological trend, for example. While now, we have a lot of news, some are real news, some are fake news, all arriving on the same screen, and without any kind of discrimination. And that's why there is such a discussion about how to fight against fake news in Europe like elsewhere. And there is many risks. There is risk for the credibility of those who provide the real news, the media, the real journalists, but there is also a risk of censorship, because some of the states are overreacting in a way and consider that the legitimate answer will be to restrict a lot of websites, of content, because of the fight also against unlawful content, like terrorist propaganda.
Can you control fake news? And if yes, then wouldn't that be limiting freedom of expression?
Yes, and so I think we have to balance the kind of measure which will be took with preserving freedom of expression. And I think that the rules must remain freedom of expression, freedom of the media, and the restriction must only be very limited and be based on very clear definition of what is unacceptable. Like, for example, terrorist video of Daesh with stabbing of hostages, because it is considered as a propaganda for violent action. But I don't think that we can accept the idea of wide legislation which will say that any kind of hate speeches, for example, has to be unlawful and to be blocked, because hate in itself is not unlawful. What is unlawful is incitement to violence or to discrimination. But previously, it was a judge who was deciding of this, and he was balancing it with the respect for freedom of expression. Now there is a tendency to demand to the internet company to do this with their algorithm, and because of the pressure of the state, they will do it very widely, and they will restrict very much more than what is really necessary. And I think this is a danger. There is also a risk of fragmentation of the internet, because I see in the OSCE region that different states have different policies regarding the restriction on internet, and the result is that it is no more possible to access to the whole internet and to all the information which are provided worldwide from any places of the region. And for example, Wikipedia is not accessible in Turkey. In Russia, you have thousands of websites which are blocked. It's the same in other countries. So here we have to discuss internationally about what is the good and the real answer to fake news. And I think that the main answer is about promoting quality of information, is about media literacy, developing critical thinking, helping people to understand that there is fake news and that they have to debunk fake news and to support those initiatives, like the fact-checking initiative by professional journalism, which will allow us to make the distinction between fake news and fact-checked.
So actually, it's a bliss that sometimes you can't reach Wikipedia because they have a lot of false information in Wikipedia too, and you can't verify if it's true or not. Having said that, I don't know if Robert would agree, but I still feel like that traditional media are being squeezed out by internet, fake news, social media, and we are in a position where we need to compete for ratings, so we're starting to play by the rules of the social media, being more sensationalist, our language being more combative, like the aesthetic of mainstream is changing. And I feel like it's a word that we have lost already, because you cannot compete with internet and social media being the mainstream and traditional media. Do you think traditional media, the mainstream media, should concentrate on self-preservation and on the basic principles that they stand for? Or do you think they should fight this war with the social media and the internet?
Was it a question for
for you?
Roger, for me? Well, I think that all this situation make it much more important for traditional media, and also for example, public services, if they are independent, to be like a landmark of quality of information. Of course, they have to compete also on a new social platform, on internet, on the kind of new technologies of information which has been developed. But one of the problems is that if you want to be sure that you will only publish checked information, it means that you will renounce partly to the run for the rapidity. Of course, a lot of people reproduce information, including fake news, because they want to be first. They want to be very quick. They see a video, they don't take the time to check if it's really in the place which is indicated, if it has to be interpreted as it is presented, and they want to reproduce it very quickly on blogs or on other support, while professional media need times. Investigation in journalism means time, for example, before you publish a news. But I think that ultimately, and I wish, there is a will of citizens to know that there is somewhere where they can find reliable information, even if it takes some more minutes or some more hours. And I think that it's very important to encourage and to support the work of professional journalism in developing code of ethics, fact-checking system, and to promote in new generation the value of this historical method of journalism.
All right, thank you very much, Arlem. Andre, I would like to address you. Now, you're a journalist, an activist. You've written extensively from the war zones and the conflict zones. How do you feel the impact of fake stories on your work directly?
Yeah, I will answer in Russian, so just the majority public will get my answers quicker. Спасибо за возможность.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak at this conference, and I'm thankful to the organizers for the invite, for Ukraine, for Ukrainian experts. It's very important to participate in a forum like this, to express an opinion on many items. And thank you, Sofika, for the question regarding the situation on Donbass. In fact, I agree with Mr. Alim Desir, OSCE representative. He regularly comes to Kiev, and his conclusions in many ways match with the general standards. And he just mentioned that in Russia there are some problems with social media. In fact, I was once in Beijing in October 2013 when I tried to cover the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China for Ukraine. Turns out Facebook doesn't work there, it's blocked. WhatsApp doesn't work, Viber doesn't work there. In Russia, there are problems now with Telegram. In Ukraine, due to national security concerns, there are difficulties. Not banned, but Одноклассники and VKontakte, they're banned. And when I came to Kazakhstan, my phone just exploded from all that. I don't remember that ever my apps would work at the same time. Одноклассники, Telegram, I guess I forgot how to use those apps. So in that context, Kazakhstan looks a convincing example of freedom of speech compared to some other post-Soviet countries.
Если мы говорим
If we are to talk about the situation in the hotbeds of tension or Ukraine in general terms, what is of concern to me, first of all, and what the Ukrainian experts have become great specialists for within those 4 years, is that the fake news are often used as the baseline for government decisions, and we can see that over the world. If you need to make some sort of a state-level decision that will affect millions of people, even countries, they might rely on the information that is not verified, but that needs to be conveyed to the people. And normally that message is conveyed to the public through the media, as decided by a specific government or politician. And that might sometimes create military conflict, and the responsibility rests with the politicians. And one of the problems which is relevant to all of the countries, in my point of view, it's a matter of time for this problem to become relevant for other countries that have not yet faced it. But the most important thing is that there is no fact-checking at the governmental level. Even if it exists, everyone forgets about it. They put it aside to be able to make the decision that they want.
In just a little bit. But before that, let me ask you, so how do you think, is fact-checking the only way to deal with this? Because you've not only written extensively about the Ukrainian conflict, but also the Syrian conflict, and that's where, we get most amount of unverified video material on basis of which the decisions are taken. And people, when they say it, it's not just the governments, they tend to believe it because it's the most emotional thing, and it's war zone, and you take it at face value. Yeah, you may get here and there a marker that says unverified video material, but no one really pays attention to that because it's the emotional part that you believe in or you choose to believe. So is it really just the fact-checking?
Нет, это не только факт-чекинг.
It's not the fact-checking only. It's a problem of moral and ethical nature, I would say, even psychological attitude of every single individual to the things that he or she is reading, where it's being read and how it's being read. I was in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, in Dushanbe recently, and when I was having a local meal jointly with the Tajik colleagues, one very highly positioned politician, Tajik politician, provoked this discussion regarding the situation in Ukraine. I tried not to discuss it because I know a lot of things. I know the person who went to Ukraine in 1989 for the last time doesn't really understand the status quo, and he was transmitting the Russian position really clearly. It's evident that he watches Russian TV on a regular basis. So I was looking to him. I was listening to him, and I tried to argument a different position, and I was able to actually prove him wrong on many of the facts that he's quoted, but he was not ready for that. He was not interested in actually getting that. in learning about that. The position that he developed in 2014 or 15 was something that he was comfortable about, and he was not willing to change it. That's what bothers me, when people create some sort of a reality in their heads and they don't want to change it. They don't really need it. It depends on the intellectual capabilities of every single individual. Omar had a wonderful presentation yesterday, and he showed how you can produce a fake story with a mobile phone, how you can use some photographs and produce some sort of a global news story that might be used as a basis for some serious information wars. Therefore, I think the fact-checking is not the only thing of relevance.
In my understanding, because people do believe fake news not because they're discovering something completely new, because it really just fits their preconceived notion to start with. So do you think an extensive, factual, unbiased media coverage can juxtapose that massive, unfiltered, unverified information that fits your beliefs?
Я думаю, это нереально.
I don't think it's realistic. And unfortunately, media are not coping with the problems existing in the countries. All that dialectics leads to some unique consequences, and very few people think of that. I think that when we face some biased information or unverified information, we experts, journalists, sometimes even non-professionals, is something that stimulates more active media involvement. Many people just put on their phone, make videos or photographs, and become a part of this active media journalism. And many say, well, it's not a good thing, you're not professional, why are you reading this? And I tell my colleagues, if you are a professional journalist and if you write things, what are you writing about? If I don't want to be reading your articles, I want to have some verified information. We had that in Donbass when lots of unprofessional journalists tried to create the so-called high-quality content and put it on the YouTube using mobile phones only. I think that all the difficult processes that we have around the fake news, they generated a new wave. They induce people into being more active. Omar showed us that we can be active using our mobile phones. Anyone can do it, because any information society, just like Kazakhstan society, sooner or later will dominate.
Right now, we're only pinpointing the problems, but I still don't see any solution to it, because you're talking about using fake news as a tactique, and the lines are being, the state lines and the front lines are being crossed, and all sides are using them. So where does this leave us right now? Nobody's immune to creating, reading, reacting to fake news?
Я думаю, что на сегодняшний день не существует.
I don't think that it exists some efficient struggle against fake news. We can, I don't know if we can fight that. I don't believe in creating such a system. It all boils down to every specific individual, his capabilities, whether he or she is capable on picking up the phone, looking and checking the information, who distributed it, and so on and so forth. I fell victim to the fake news in some ways, I would say, because sometimes I don't have time to verify that information, who distributed it and why, but sooner or later we'll be able to overcome those stereotypes. Although there is no efficient fight against fake news, every single person can verify it on their own, if we want to hear the truth. And the truth that is being distributed through the fake news is not something that we want. And if we want to be listening to the fake news and we're happy about that, we're content, then we shouldn't be presenting any claims to the politicians or the journalists, because that means that you like the information that a specific politician or some political group is trying to convey to you.
To address you, Andrei is saying that right now there is no effective way to fight fake news or to stop this tendency. You are an activist in that field, I would say, or else why would you come up with a platform like that, fact-checking platform? What does it fight in the first place, your platform?
Ну, кстати говоря, ситуация в Украине.
By the way, the situation in Ukraine was one of the impulses, one of the incentives. We were saying that there is only one conversation about Ukraine that takes you from love to hate, because everyone somehow quarreled with each other in Kazakhstan over Ukraine. I would like to extend this fake news concept and incorporate misinformation. Because fake news is only a part of that misinformation. Promises that the politicians make and never keep them, that's also misinformation. It's not fake news, but that's another problem that is no less toxic and dangerous. At the same time, it's probably not about misinformation so much. It's about the ability of the audience. I would agree with Andrei. The ability of the audience to make to do this fact-checking, at least on a preventive level, to be knowledgeable and to understand the media and the information, to treat information critically in a mature way without naivety. That's one thing. Another thing is to have some sort of an internal classifier to rate that information somehow. Misinformation surrounds us everywhere. On Instagram, we have those like dog's ears and tails, and that's misinformation as well. However, you have large-scale misinformation that is transmitted by the speakers influencing the events, such as politicians, opinion leaders, and so on and so forth. And that's a part of the problem. That's the fact-checkers who address that problem. And we were inspired by that to set up the first Central Asian fact-checking resource, and we check influence politicians and opinion leaders. We check information related to the budgets. Anything related to the budgets, to the society, anything of public interest is checked by us.
Only specializing in checking how truthful are the statements of politicians and people of influence. Do I understand correctly? And their impact on the society.
Не только. Даже
We check journalists as well. Sometimes those journalists make very vivid headlines to attract readers, but they misinform.
About misinformation. And you said fake news is not just fabricated news, but it's also misinformation. Misinformation is a large concept. For instance, some journalists or commentators, they like to be subjective, and there's nothing wrong with that. They're not making up anything. They're just expressing their opinion and giving the information to you the way they see it, how they relate to the world. Is that misinformation? Would you be fact-checking them because they have their opinion on it? But they're not making up anything.
If you allow, I will give you a couple of examples. For instance, if a journalist misunderstands something or exaggerate things. For instance, 100 years ago, there were some tigers introduced into Kazakhstan, and some years ago the last was shot down, so we have no tigers anymore. Now they started talking about recreating the tiger population in Kazakhstan, and there is a famous actor, Leonardo DiCaprio, who is involved in similar programs, and one of our experts trying to recreate the tiger project in Kazakhstan stated apparently Leonardo DiCaprio will be a part of the Kazakhstan tiger recreation program. But as the budget funds were mentioned with regards to this program, we got interested in that. The journalist wrote Leonardo DiCaprio will recreate the Kazakhstan tigers. We decided to check it. We contacted the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. We found the manager, and he refuted this information. This was a misinformation. I don't know whether they've done it in order to attract the readers or to make it pompous or to do some propaganda. We're not interested, but we were interested in that because it was related to the budget funds.
I think another really important topic is also fake news from conflict or war zones, and we will all agree on that, because when you take decisions based on fake news and it has to do with the destiny of a country, that's also very grave. Would you, on your side, go further, take it further, and maybe try to fact-check some of the fake news stories that come out of conflict zones?
Это возможно.
It is possible. It will require some efforts. We have some partnership network. We're trying to set up the Eurasian fact-checking network with our colleagues in Ukraine, Russia, and so on. In fact, the fact-checking tools are pretty simple. As some sort of a Google search based on a picture, or you can check a video to see if it's fake as well. If you allow me, I'm very interested in this topic of balance that Mr. Desir mentioned regarding fact-checking and fake news, the toxicity, and so on and so forth. If I were to choose the freedom of speech on the one hand, on the other hand, blocking all the liars, I would have chosen the freedom of speech as a fundamental right. I think it's the most important thing. As for the conflict areas, I think that all of the topics related to those zones of conflict are sensitive. We're interested in that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to turn to Katerina. Your work in Ukraine has always been very journalistic. I mean, you didn't go on crusades. You wrote about the complex situations without fear of backlash from one or the other side. You run a very progressive, serious project. Do you feel that you can win the competition from flashy, less than solid, biased news stories with your balanced, well-researched journalism? Because I want to talk about what fake news and all of that does to our profession.
Спасибо.
Thank you. First of all, I think I should talk about the situation in Ukraine when it comes to the fake news, so that it is important to in order to understand the situation that we have. In 2014, the fake stories started harming Ukraine really badly, and we felt that at the very start of that conflict in the Crimea and then in Donbass, as thanks to those fake stories that were distributed through the Russian propaganda outlets, media outlets. We've had a whole flow of people who got into get engaged in that war against Ukraine, and that affected the media landscape of our country. As the journalists, politicians, and officials realized very quickly that the fake stories is what we need to fight against, because this is a part of the real war. This is something that affects us very directly. After that, the landscape was changed. I would say it might be described as an effort, not even an effort, but many journalists started feeling responsible, and that feeling of responsibility was extremely high. Many of those journalists became activists. I would say they felt like they have to fight against those fake news, and they have to fight against the things threatening the information security in the country. And nowadays, 4 years later, after the start of the armed conflict, the general trend is that many journalists in Ukraine tend not to somehow release some of the stories, not to talk about some of the events or opinions that might adversely affect the real situation. I think that it's a pretty big part of the problem related to this profession. My personal opinion is that a journalist must communicate information of social importance to the public, and when there is some self-censorship, most likely that will cause harm to the society for which this journalist works for. And we have a lot of discussions with regards to this trend. I'm sure that this is something that exists in many countries. Self-censorship. As we are all in the same information space, and we can see how information is reflected on our real life. This situation is often used by the politicians as well, as the politicians have learned how to use those fake news in order to get where they want to go. Andrei spoke about that as well, and this is something that is being actively discussed at the moment. And they are not interested in journalism as a profession or in a journalist as an individual checking those facts and being credible in the eyes of the public, because the credibility of journalism is certainly a very big resource, and those who have that resource can have the power. I think that we can extend it to all other countries. It's not something relevant to Ukraine only. Many politicians try to take this credibility from journalists.
By saying that you're very balanced and you own a very serious platform. Do you feel whatever you're saying politicians are doing or the journalists are doing, or once again back to my question, the fake news is doing to the industry, do you feel the effect? Do more people read you or less people read you? Do more people trust you or less people trust you with the situation that surrounds us?
I think that when it comes to my attitude to the subject under discussion today, we can fight fake news by telling the truth, by checking all the information coming from the journalists, by restoring the confidence on the part of the public or of the audience. And I can see that it's happening little by little, unfortunately very slowly, not as fast as we would like it to be. However, we will not be able to do anything. We will not be able to do things. We need to use truth, fact-checking, and no self-censorship.
Do you feel like it's a segregated audience, those who want to know the truth, the balance, the fact-checked journalism? Are we living in more of a bubble-like society? Because to me, whatever we're discussing before, it seems like people read what they want to read, and it's almost like nothing challenges you anymore. Do more people read you or less people read you? What is your audience? Is it segregated or is it growing?
Я вижу в том числе...
I see, among other things, a trend of people starting to learn to perceive information, to filter. At least in Ukraine, at the very least, the society is growing, and I'm observing this struggle, this combat of fake and fact, and of everything in between. People starting to gradually realize this, and people strive to divide fakes from true information, and very often people do their own fact-checking. In Ukraine, we see quite a lot of projects emerging that are doing just that, teaching people, not the journalists, but regular people, teaching people how to check information. And that works really well. For regular users of government benefits, for instance, when they know how to get certain kind of information from the government, we have a project called Access to Truth. I don't know whether such projects exist in any other post-Soviet country, but it's a very simple mechanism that lets any citizen send an inquiry to any government agency, ministry, whatnot, to get open information of anything of interest to them. And that works great. That brings a person, an individual, closer to the state, to the government, and that reduces the number of all sorts of rumors, misconceptions, and fakes and the likes.
It's not just fake news, but how technologies are changing the whole industry and new platforms. And you're running a digital journalism website. In that field, we're seeing also big changes because the new internet media giants like BuzzFeed, Huffington Post, they're now competing with the old giants, but they're aggregators. They rarely produce their own news. So I wonder, what do aggregators do to your business or to our business? Is it a good thing for journalism and for media in general? Because they run a business model more than anything else in the first place. And journalism is not about money. We don't go to journalism to be rich, like you go to be a banker to be rich, right? Maybe in America. But
Ну, если это вопрос ко мне или ко всем?
К вам.
Ко мне.
Is that a question to me or to everyone? To you. I like, well, Aggregator is a machine that does not yet, at this time, filter fake from fact. And I think we need such technologies to emerge that would have certain screens. A good example of an aggregator, almost aggregator, is Medusa. It's a Russian publication that perfectly plays the role of an aggregator. Yes, but there are live people dedicated, sitting there, who put together a map of the use of the day and do so professionally. And they have mechanisms that let their readers see the extent to which this news is serious when it comes to the source. I respect that kind of an aggregator. Хорошо, спасибо. Юзеф.
I want to continue the topic of new model versus old model because you're obviously representing the 21st century new tech startup person, and the future is yours. So the site you're running, I feel personally, I may be wrong, is competing with what I do and what I stand for. Your slogan is more stories, more truth. But do more stories usually mean more truth?
I don't think necessarily RT or traditional media and new media are competing. They can see it as the greatest threat to their business, or they can see it as the greatest opportunity. I think if you took this panel, for example, and the extent to which how polarized the world is, if I was to tell somebody that somebody from Russia today is anchoring a panel about fact-checking and fake news, it would sound like a sick joke in many parts of the world. I'm not saying that you're not. I think you're a very good journalist, and I think that your organization does some good work.
I'm happy to answer any questions after the panel. I'm just here as a moderator right now.
This is the massively polarized world that we live in, where we live on opposite ends of this echo chamber. And the ability to tap into new media and to tap into many voices, more perspectives, more angles, I believe can only equal more truth. Take what's happened over the last 24 hours. There was a storm that took place in the capital city of Astana. Do I trust one camera to tell me that there was a storm? Or do I trust hundreds, if not thousands of cameras and the ability to accurately verify those cameras? And I think that the question here that we haven't been answering is the solutions. We're talking about the problem, but who's actually going to fix this shit? I think it lies with everybody. I think that the platforms have a huge responsibility, the Facebooks, the Twitters, the YouTubes, the Snapchats of the world, and they can do a hell of a lot. If we believe that the world is moving in a video direction, today 50% of the internet is made of video, by 2020, 75% of the internet is going to be made up of video, the platforms need to do a better job of checking the metadata that's baked into a video to see, was this video actually shot today? Because just a couple of years ago, there was a storm allegedly in Astana, which was fake news. Somebody disseminated fake videos about a storm that wasn't even taking place at that time or even in that city. So I think the platforms have a huge responsibility, and they can't do it alone. Facebook are hiring some 10,000 more fact checkers to help work out what is and isn't real. It's not going to work. I think traditional media have a huge responsibility to help us separate the voices from the noise, to help us work out, okay, there's a great amount of noise here, what should be bubbling to the top of social media timelines. But at the end of the day, it's exactly as you put it. Fact checkers can play their part, but at the end of the day, fake news only spreads if people spread it. It relies on virality on social media.
But how do you make sure that whatever people shoot on their camera and post on your platform is not fake news? Do you have fact checkers? Are you a big news organization?
So it's the difference between social discovery and social empowerment. Social discovery means searching the net and saying, hey, this video is going viral, let's use this. Social empowerment is going into an actual community, meeting people, training them as to become storytellers, to become journalists, and then using them as your reporters effectively. We believe that everybody in the world can be a reporter. And since 9/11, since the Twin Towers went down, it has been people with phones that have been bringing us the biggest stories of our time. It takes journalists, like people on this panel, like you guys, to help work out what is and isn't real. So I think the media need to stop pretending like we are the sole arbiters of truth. As you rightfully put it, we lost that battle a long time ago. We will never be the first to give you the who, the where, the what, the when. What we should be focusing is the why and the how. And exactly as you put it, that sometimes lends itself to taking a stand, to saying, oh, I take a stand on this issue, I have an opinion. And that's being confused with fake news, and that's not fake news. And I think the media needs to become a lot more comfortable with saying, hey, we take a stand. We're on the side of #MeToo. We take a stand for Black Lives Matter. But when the media take a stand, when RT take a stand on a particular issue, the opposite end of the spectrum point at them and say, oh, that's fake news, they're disseminating fake news, when they're not. They're actually disseminating an opinion.
Yeah, but my question was somewhat different, about a blurred line between what journalism represents, because there is still such a profession as journalism, and we follow certain rules and ethics, no matter for which channel you work. I mean, we abide by those rules. And there's a difference between a person who can be his own reporter and post something on internet, and that is also considered journalism. That is where I have a problem. Should there be maybe, I don't know, a labeling like of sort, like on packs of cigarettes or like products, they have GMO written on them, then this is not an authentic journalism product. That would make me feel much better. I don't know.
My worry is who on earth is going to make that decision? Is Facebook going to make that decision? Because I don't trust them to. Are fact-checking authorities going to make that decision? Because what if they decide that CNN is journalism and RT is not? That's the problem. I don't think we can have the stamp of approval that somebody is a professional and somebody is not. Having said that, the role of the professional journalist has never been more relevant. Off the back of the Trump elections, the New York Times saw a massive graph like this of people subscribing to their paper. Because in this landscape where there is so much rubbish, we are hungry for real truth. And that's where I think journalists have never been more relevant.
But then I guess you never answered my original question. How do you filter fake news on your platform or platforms like yours? How do you make sure that whatever people post and their freedom of expression doesn't give way to fake news that could actually influence in a very negative way the audiences?
Absolutely. Interestingly enough, we do it through closed groups. So people will submit content through Messenger and closed groups, and within that group, they will have an editor of their community, and they'll have comments in that closed group from their community who help decide, actually, I didn't hear it like that, I didn't hear it like that. Using those analytics, we then surface to the top the stories that we believe are performing best, and then we go through the journalistic process of saying, is this factually correct? Have we got our ducks in a row? And then we take that towards publishing. So it's actually very similar to a traditional journalism workflow in that you have a layer of verification, of authentication, even to your reporters through sub-editors, through producers before you publish.
All right, I just want to probably ask a question or two to all of the speakers, and maybe you can express your opinion. I still didn't get a precise answer or a tangible answer on how to fight fake news and how to decipher journalism from this unverified, massive video and written material that we get on the internet. My question to Yusuf is valid to all of you. Should there be some sort of a label that differentiates this from that?
Well, first I think that there is a lot of new initiative to try to provide fact-checking and to make it more visible to the public. For example, I was in Norway recently, and there is an initiative called Faktisk. I think it's very interesting because it's most of the main media, both printed press and broadcasting media, private and public, who decided to go together and to support an independent fact-checking initiative. While in other countries like France, some media have created different platforms. I think there is not one model, and we are just in the beginning of the era of fake news and the beginning of the era of fact-checking and how to promote reliable information. There is also a new initiative by AFP, Reporters Without Borders, EBU, which are the main public service broadcaster, and they call it Journalist Trust Initiative, and it will be a little bit more about what you say, like giving a label so that on any platform, if you see an information with this label, it means that it has been endorsed by these participants. They will support this initiative. But what about the fact that perhaps they will not give the label to certain media? Doesn't mean that the other media are fake news. But it means that there is a lot of attention within the professional community of journalists or of a media creator to engage their own credibility on some kind of support and some kind of information. On the other side, I think it's very much important to develop critical thinking of the citizen, of the viewer, and media literacy. Why? Because as it has been said, in the future, and it's already beginning, there will be like a problem of credibility of any videos, for example, or audio messages. It will be very easy to make me speak in a conference nowadays, not today, in another city, and with a reproduction of my voice, to make me make a declaration which I have not made. And so it will not be very easy for the viewer to be sure that any kind of information, and especially video, because more of the content on the social platform will be video, is true or is not true. So it will be up to the viewer to be able to understand that he has to check. He has to check twice before reproducing it or before believing it. He has to look to some fact-checking places or to the New York Times or to Russia Today, if you believe in Russia Today, to know if it is endorsed. I will check twice, not only on Russia Today or on my own point of view. But I think that's important also to learn to the viewer that there is different media which are dedicated to some kind of ethics, as you say, with journalists who believe in professional standards. And if you see something, you can check to these places. And I don't think that the answer will be to try to avoid the existing of fake information or fake news. Something else is the manipulation of information intentionally by state, which use, for example, bots and troll factory to try to create a trouble in another country or to meddle in an election, so to in a way, alter the sovereignty of another nation. Here, I think it's an issue which has to be discussed by the states at the international level, and I think they should commit officially not to do.
There must be a law, an internet law.
There will not be an agreement on what is propaganda. There is not in international treaties. But there is in international treaties, especially in the Helsinki Final Act, which is the base of the OSCE, the fact that states will not do propaganda for war. Of course, it's very specific. But I think it also means that you will avoid to use the information sphere to create trouble or war or conflict with other partners. And all the states are supposed to be partners in the international community, especially in the OSCE, where I recall there is Russia, United States, Ukraine, Turkey, European. And so we are supposed not, the states are supposed not to use the information sphere, even if they want to do their own promotion, but to create trouble and conflict with other states. And this is a very specific issue which has to be discussed politically among the states, but not to be answered through censorship.
Thank you. Roger, what do you think? Should there be labels, considering that people usually go for roller coasters, not merry-go-rounds?
The issue with that, and I agree with Adil, which is who's going to decide those labels and to whom they are assigned. When you reduce this to its essence, it really comes down to the individual, and I'm going to try to arrive at maybe roughly the same place through a different angle. When you look at least in the context of the United States, you could make a great case that the informed consumer has done more for environmental protection, for example, than government policy has. If you look at how the American consumer goes out and makes decisions about what products are recyclable and are produced in a responsible manner, be that food or anything else, that same sense of responsibility has to be brought to bear. In an interview just a little while ago, I used the analogy of food. A lot of people are very scrutinous of how much sugar or fat or salt is in something. And so ultimately, the burden for at least what gets into your news flow and into your understanding of the world has to be subject to that same rigorous level of scrutiny. trying to check and trying to verify that some news source actually exists, that it's a bricks and mortar facility somewhere, even if it's a small upstart kind of team, that they're transparent, that they're accountable, that their web page isn't just 2 pages deep and then it disappears and the most recent information on it is from 2 years ago. Clearly some kind of, amateurish front. So ultimately, your questions in one form or another are getting to who decides and what's the fix. And the fix is informed individuals exercising, their own judgment and a level of scrutiny about information that is of the same level of rigor that they would to the products they buy or to the food that they bring home from the grocery store for their family.
All right, thank you. So, Andre, Katerina, you both spoke a lot about developing critical thinking and ability of the audiences to analyze the inflow of the information. What do you think should be done in that sense? Because what I'm thinking also is that maybe we're underestimating the humankind, because when you look at propagandas, whether it's Soviet propaganda or any other ethnocentric nation propaganda, people believe in it at first, but then they become obsolete and people stop to believe in it. Just like fake news, maybe they believe it in now, but like in a year or 2 or 3, they're not going to be a new thing anymore, and people are just going to stop believing them. Maybe we don't trust humans enough on this.
I personally, I have my own strategy on this of fighting fake news. If you have any questions, call me. That's something I would want to say, but I wouldn't do that, especially when it comes to Ukraine-related issues. But I'm convinced that everything depends on 3 main types of fakes. The strategy depends on the kind of fake you're dealing with. I see there are 3 kinds. They're universal and optimal. First is intergovernmental fakes, when they come as in the framework of information wars, and when there are standoffs of governments. It's very hard to fight that. It's impossible even at the level of experts. It's the governments fighting. There has to be some system developed. In Ukraine, Kato already mentioned there are special sites such as Stop Fake and others that are trying to do something, but they work for specialized people who specialize on information. Laymen don't very often visit such sites, so strategy of fighting off fakes at intergovernmental level is very complicated. And I think governments should find a solution at a political level, based on the position of the leadership of the country on specific issues, should develop a corresponding strategy. A second group of fakes is, I call them intra-oligarch or intra-political. These are my most favorite fakes. I don't want to say that I distribute such. No, I analyze such. Fakes in Ukraine is a very hot topic, given that it's 10 months to presidential campaign launch, the election, and of course a major struggle is tide of fakes would come around there, because now we see such material being used that is just beyond evil, like example of Mikhail Saakashvili. Despite of your take on him. In Ukraine, when we had active political struggle against him, some experts, some journals tried to connect him to some Russian connections, claiming that he's connected to Russia and even things like that. Ukrainian society, most people didn't take that because you can say there are a lot of people can have connection, but Mikhail Saakashvili isn't exactly the person who falls into that. And in that sense, the society had grown, developed immunity, if you say, the civil society, in taking any information served to them with a serious grains of salt. And that speaks of level of development. And the third group of fakes is fakes that I can create right here, right now, publish something, post something, lie and just post it in the internet. I think those types of fakes should simply be ignored because they don't really affect the masses, but some of the speakers said the right thing. What do fakes pursue? Fake is not a goal, it's an instrument, it's a tool of impacting the masses, people's attention, and it was written, people wrote about it in the early 19th, 20th century, and when the Third Reich was creating the myth that it's unbeatable, and the Soviet Union was creating its own myth that the Union will never fall apart, and it did, and many people believed that. And in that context, it seems to me that it's very important to develop one's own immunity, and the society should develop its immunity in checking information. I believe that the society is developed, and they do, and again, that's based on the realities in which we live in.
Sophie, in fact, Andrei said the right things that, in fact, match what I think. What he didn't say, and I think that it needs to be said, we need to have media education, probably starting at school at early age, because people need to be trained. They need to know how news is made, how information works, how the networks work. That's the basis that they need to know.
Need to know how to be a journalist or how journalism works. I don't quite understand. How can you teach people in school how journalism works?
Да, я говорю о механизмах.
I'm talking about the mechanisms of journalism for everyone. In fact, an individual should know what news consists of. I would say this is the basis for them to be able to understand where it's fake, where it's not fake, to be able to verify the information. Anyone should know this. Not to become a journalist, but to learn how to see and how to separate the truth from the things that are not truthful. And if we manage to have such programs all over the world, I think the world will be able to change very quickly. In 10 years, people on Earth will be very knowledgeable. It will be difficult to deceive them. And politicians or criminals will not be able to do that.
Educate people from early ages at school to know what journalism is about, or is fake news a trend that's going to pass and people are going to realize themselves that it's just fake news?
I think young people need to learn to be more critical of all types of media, to be really critical and to also understand referencing. You spoke about the idea of labeling stuff, whether it's journalistic, but the idea that we could score something based on the amount of sources it has, based on the amount of other news organizations that have said that, based on the credibility of the sources that they've used. I think if young people are taught to interrogate those sources, it's incredibly important. I think young people, the biggest threat for me for young people and fake news is actually not from traditional media, and it's not even on social media timelines. It's in what we call dark social. If I talk about South Africa in particular, where I'm based at the moment, or even Telegram, where WhatsApp is big, or Telegram here, this is the real cesspits that we're seeing of fake news, because it's closed circles where people are able to share stories that are not open for public interrogation. We have no analytics. Facebook cannot tell us how many people are sharing in WhatsApp, whether it's thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of people sharing a fake story. And I think if they can start being critical of dark social in particular, that's going to be the next fighting ground that none of us are going to have any control over.
Adil, how would you sum this up? What should be done? Should there be labels? Not? Should we educate people more on this?
As far as I know, the global players such as Facebook and Google are trying to develop this type of marking to define the credibility of the source. I think there are three major pillars. This media literacy and information literacy for the general audience, including the politicians, so that they would know how to check the information, at least general as at a primary level. And then not all of the information needs to be checked for fakes. It's just the scalable information, toxic, sensitive types of stories. And then the third point, I think that the state should stay away from it. What do I mean? Our state is involved very actively into creating and generating that fake news and then fighting against it. And very often the state is tempted to fight alternative ideas under that flag, so it's better to use it through self-regulation. The audience as such, the network communities, journalist communities, will be able to handle and deal with it, because the government can spoil it all and use it and misuse it. I think those are the three basic things.
I think we should move to our expert. Asel, please, your questions. We will have the questions from the audience right after our expert asks the speaker. You have about 5 to 7 minutes with the speakers, please.
Для начала можно я...
To start with, let me sum it up a little bit. I would like to give you my opinion with regards to fake news and the fake information in general. Being the first editor of the first fact-checking resource in Central Asia, I should say that when we founded FactCheck.kz, our first two objectives were to develop this critical thinking, and then the second, to increase the level of media literacy, because you cannot check all of the fakes and you cannot verify all of the information. You can devote your whole life to that, but not manage to do that. It's important for people to learn how to classify those things, because ratings is not the first thing for the media to get. The first thing that they need to be looking for is confidence, credibility, and we need to be fighting for that. The media need to realize their responsibility. We had this white smoke information and then insect treatment information on one of the respectable platforms, and we were requested to check it. A lot was said about confidence by Mr. Desir. I would agree with him completely. And then we need to address the purposes of fakes, whether that's information wars or just fake messages distributed in messengers to spread the panic, to misinform the population, to create some instability, or this is some sort of a war, information war among the groups of oligarchs, industrial oligarchs, and so on and so forth. Now you can continue with your questions. I have a question. Could you please introduce it? Alabek Abdarbekuli, in the International University of Information Technologies. I have a question to Adil Jalilov, Andrei Buzalov, and Ekaterina. Here's my question. When it comes to information coverage, would you classify what you're doing, or when you are trying to check your information, what kind of types are you facing with? For instance, we didn't know whether it was a fake or a fiction that Lenin was funded by German money. When I went to Germany, indeed I see some caricatures depicting him as Lenin sitting on a sack of German marks. And I would say we might have lots of examples like this. In the Western press, sometimes some of the stories would come up, and the Soviet government would say that this is fake, it's fiction, it never existed, someone made it up, those are the lies. So based on that historical legacy, how would you classify that?
Your answer is Kurt, because it's the three of you answering, so we can get other questions from the audience too.
Вы очень интересную фразу.
You used a very interesting phrase in Russian, like a kind of dissection of information. I use the same thing when I open up the banana. When I open it up, I look to see if it's rotten or not. If it's rotten, then I can eat it, but I don't know what the consequences would be. Same thing about information. When you see it, you need to see what it's like. You can, in fact, consume it for your own needs, or rebroadcast it, use it for your own purposes, but I don't know what the consequences would be. I'm talking about the purpose of that information, be that discreditation or fake. To me, as an analyst, it is all the same. Although there might be some intention behind that misinformation, if discreditation, it could be also intentional, and a fake could be just improvised. I can say something, then some media outlet can do something, and then it would be rebroadcasted, then it could be translated into English or in Ukrainian, if it's translated into English, they might change it certainly, and then, or in Kazakh, and then this fake news will be wandering around. How can I refute it? If I'm not contacted, then I cannot do anything about it. If I'm not contacted, then it will exist as a cliche. And it's a scary thing when you have some sort of a label attached to you and you don't even realize it's the same thing for the Soviet people. Everyone was waiting for the US to collapse, the Western world to die. Even in late 80s, they said the bourgeois society is about to collapse, and in fact, the USSR ended up breaking up. It is not something that could be classified as a threat to Kazakhstan or Ukraine. As I mentioned, in Kazakhstan, all apps are up and working, and Odnoklassniki and Kontakte, that's a positive thing. And the Ukrainian society, despite of the complex processes, continues its informational development. It's trying to develop at least some immunity in terms of perceiving different types of information. Thank you. I think the question was different, while the answer was right. I think the question was about hiding the information. I think it's about self-censorship. We cannot classify it as misinformation or fake. That's a separate thing that works on its own. This is when you are not able to convey some important information to a big audience, and sooner or later the audience will learn about it, but the situation might develop differently. Yusuf? I will be very brief. I didn't get the question, but if we're talking about hiding, there is historical fact-checking, there is work related to the archives, and there is always different solutions. But there is another criterion, checkability. Unfortunately, some of the information cannot be checked. That.
Oh, sorry.
Dr. Shahid Qureshi, I'm editor of London Post, and I teach media and journalism and psychological warfare in China. I was really worried about that you didn't put the right title for this debate. What we're talking about here is the 4th and 5th generation psychological warfare. And as part of that is that if a product is free, then you are the product. So if you're getting Facebook, those messengers for free, then you are the product of that psychological warfare. The problem I was a field journalist. I started from a newspaper, so I was a crime reporter, 20 years experience. The problem we are having at the moment is that everybody and anybody is taking a microphone and a camera and pretending to be a journalist. And that is causing a lot of problems, because a responsible journalism is fact-checking, yes, ethical, yes, morally true, yes. It's not about telling truth or lies. It's RT is good and BBC is crap. The reality is that what information you want to disseminate to your people, whether it is suitable for them or not suitable for them. You don't have an operation by a nurse. You will go for a surgeon to have your operation. So why we're expecting anybody and everybody to have a microphone to be a journalist? Now, final point is the war parties have actually infiltrated into the media, and they are running the show. So that's why when we see RT, we see a different version. When I see your show, which is different. When we see BBC, when we see Palestinians being killed at Gaza border, nobody worried about anything. But when we see a fake story about the chemical attack in Syria, we see fighter jets going and bombing and killing more people. So this is what dividing people and people taking people far apart from each other. And the final point is that freedom of information is important, but freedom of individual is also very important, and we should respect the individual to have their freedom. Thank you.
Thank you. So you didn't have a question. Thanks for the remark. Maxime, please ask your question.
To that, if you may. You're basically saying that the democratization of storytelling is not a good thing, and that's absolutely bullshit, to be honest with you. If you look at parts of East Aleppo today, there are no official journalists on the ground. If we didn't have the witness account of citizen journalists, of communities, we wouldn't have a clue what's happening in those areas. Yes, they're riddled in bias. Yes, they're full of agendas, but that doesn't mean that that information is not of value.
Thank you. Maxime.
I'll clap for that.
Здравствуйте.
Hello, Maxim Shevchenko, a Russian journalist. You know, there is always a war. The war is always out there in the history of humanity. There is always propaganda and counter-propaganda on both sides of the front. And during the First World War, we were told that the Germans would pierce the babies and so on and so forth. And since then, all of those myths have been circulating. Some of those are true, some of them are lies. I think fact-checking is only possible after the situation, post factum, once we are handling the ruins and trying to discover things about human woes and sufferings. And we still don't know everything on the Second World War. We don't know what the causes were. We're always in this situation when we're living in this infinite myth and fiction situations. Some of those who were defeated would have to go down to their knees and say we were an absolute evil. And the winners are always taken as the good guys. I would say this is an institutionalized mythology that does not enable us to get out of this situation, the situation of misinformation and mystification. And therefore, my question is as follows. Maybe what we are aspiring to now, which is understanding the truth and the authenticity, is not possible at all in the official systematized journalism. It is probably only possible as an individual effort, as some sort of a confrontation, countering the totalitarianized ordinarity. Totalitarianism might be also a requirement of liberty, general and common for everyone. We understand that. Maybe those personality type issues and cooperation of people across the front lines and across the camps, whether it will be possible in principle or not, whether the states will allow that, whether that would be a personal choice, heroic change and concern.
Sure.
Really quickly. I think the first part of his question was a great example about why, at least looking at it through an American lens, that government is not the solution to this. Because you keep coming back to what's the solution, right? There's a saying in the United States: you can't yell fire in a movie theater, and in fact you can. That was a case during World War I. It was Yiddish protesters who wanted to hand out leaflets protesting and trying to get President Wilson to not enter World War I. And if ever there was a crowded fire in a movie theater, it was World War I. That was subsequently overturned, but it's commonly used as a casual reference for why certain levels of speech or certain content should be subject to government control. And in fact, most of the American people have that wrong, and it's a perfect example of why government is ill-suited to be the arbiter of a lot of the questions that we're talking about right here.
The question is very interesting, as we are all witnesses of some unique events, and we all have this unique opportunity while we are still alive to figure out what is going on or what was going on if we are to look at Donbass. Many of those facts are evident. The witnesses are alive. It exists. I was trying to figure out who was the initiative for this approximation of China and the United States in 1976. When you read Henry Kissinger, he says that this was China's initiative to make up with the Americans. When you read the Chinese sources, they say it were the Americans who initiated this process of making up with China. I didn't witness that process because I was not yet born. And the situation of the latest 4 years can be analyzed by us, and we have those unique opportunities and the willingness to dig the truth out. I think that's what we need to do. We need to use those chances.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you, all of you speakers. It was wonderful talking to you. Thanks for wonderful questions from the audience.